Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the only way to survive is to devour your own children. This is not science fiction. This has happened, and it happens more often than you might think. Deep inside a dense forest, where sunlight barely manages to break through the leaves, there is a city. Not of humans, but of ants. Millions of them. Working, building, defending. A perfect machine of collective life that has existed for thousands of years without stopping. This colony was different. Not because of its size. Not because of its species. But because of what it was about to do. It all began during a period that seemed completely normal. The workers left at dawn in long, organized lines, almost military. Each one knew exactly what it needed to do. Some carried leaf fragments larger than their own bodies. Others transported dead insects back to the nest. It was an ancient dance, repeated every day, without fail. At the center of everything, protected by layers and layers of tunnels carved into the moist earth, was the queen. Enormous. Immobile. Generating life at a constant rate. Dozens of eggs per hour. Larvae that would be fed, cared for, and transformed into the colony's next workers. The colony breathed like a single organism. And that organism was healthy. But that wasn't the worst part yet. In the following weeks, something began to change in the surrounding environment. The forest, once generous, began to close its doors. A silent drought was creeping in. Not the dramatic kind that kills trees and dries rivers, but the subtle, treacherous kind that slowly drains resources, almost without anyone noticing. Foraging trails grew longer. The workers returned with less food. Sometimes, they came back with empty mandibles. Inside the nest, the reserves began to shrink. At first, no one, so to speak, noticed. The colony kept functioning. The queen kept laying eggs. The larvae kept growing. Life went on. But there is a cruel rule that governs all ant colonies, a rule that humans take years to discover and are still disturbed when they do. When resources run out, the system does not collapse. It adapts. And that's when everything changed. The first signs were almost imperceptible. A larva that disappeared from the nursery without explanation. An egg that vanished during the night. The workers responsible for brood care began to behave strangely, a little agitated, a little hesitant. As if they knew what was coming. As if the entire nest was holding its breath before making a decision there would be no coming back from. And the question that no one had yet asked out loud began to take shape in the depths of that dark earth. When food runs out, who are you willing to sacrifice? If it's to survive. Hunger inside an ant colony does not work like human hunger. It has no face, no crying, no visible desperation. It acts in silence, like a poison that slowly paralyzes the system from within, layer by layer, until the organism is forced to make choices that no living being should ever have to make. And this colony was reaching that point. The food reserves, which once filled entire chambers carved with surgical precision, were now at half. Then a third. Then almost nothing. The foraging workers kept going out, but the forest was growing quieter. The insects that once filled the leaves had vanished. The natural sugar sources had dried up. Even the fungi cultivated inside the nest, those that some species maintain like true underground farms, began to wither from the lack of fresh organic material. The colony was being strangled. But that wasn't the worst part. That's when the workers' behavior truly began to change. Ants are programmed to act for the good of the collective. That is the foundation of everything. The individual does not matter. The colony does. It's a cold logic, almost unsettling when you really think about it. But it is exactly this logic that makes them so efficient. So unstoppable. And it was this same logic that began to turn the nest into something disturbing. The first to feel the impact were the youngest larvae. Small, vulnerable, unable to move or defend themselves. They depended entirely on the workers to survive, to be fed, warmed, protected. But now, the workers arriving at the nursery were arriving with empty mandibles. And they began to linger longer than they should around the larvae. Watching. Scientists who study this phenomenon describe it with a chilling detachment. The colony begins to calculate. Not consciously, there is no individual awareness in an ant. But the system as a whole starts to weigh lives. How many larvae can survive with the available food? How many workers are needed to keep the nest functioning? Who is essential? Who is expendable? And that's when everything truly changed. The first larvae disappeared during the night. No struggle. No resistance. They simply vanished. And in the places where they had been, the workers continued moving as if nothing had happened. As if it were natural. As if it had always been this way. But something even more disturbing was happening in the deepest chambers of the nest. The queen had not stopped laying eggs. She continued producing life at a constant rate, because that is her only function, her only reason to exist. She does not know the reserves are gone. She does not know the larvae are disappearing. She only knows how to do one thing: create more mouths to feed. And the more eggs she laid, the more the system slipped into silent collapse. The colony was trapped in a cruel paradox. It needed more food to sustain the larvae, but it had no food. And it kept producing larvae anyway. That's when the workers made a decision. A decision that does not exist in any human survival manual. A decision that goes against everything we understand about maternal instinct, protection, and care. A decision that, once you fully understand it, is impossible to forget. They stopped protecting the larvae and began to look at them differently. The first act of cannibalism inside an ant colony does not happen with violence. There is no scream, no escape, no battle. It happens with a calmness that is almost more disturbing than any brutality could ever be. It was during a moonless night, at least, that's how I like to imagine it, that the nursery workers finally crossed the line. One larva was removed from the group, carried with the same care, the same delicacy they had always used, as if it were being relocated, as if it were about to receive special attention. But it was not taken to another care chamber. It was taken to the food chamber. And there, without ceremony, without hesitation, it was consumed. The entire nest continued to function normally. The trails kept their rhythm. The sentinels remained at their posts. The queen kept laying eggs, as if nothing had happened, as if it were just another task on the list, another gear in the system turning exactly where it should. But that wasn't the worst part. In the following days, the process accelerated. Not chaotically, and that is precisely what makes it terrifying. In an organized, methodical way, the workers began to silently sort the larvae. The weakest, the smallest, the ones with the lowest chances of surviving to adulthood, were the first to be selected. It was a brutal logic, but it was still logic. The colony was not going insane. It was adapting. And it worked. For a while, it worked. The internal consumption of larvae generated enough energy to keep the adult workers active. The nest survived the first week. Then the second. The foragers kept trying to find food outside, but now with less urgency, because there was a source of food inside the nest. A source that renewed itself automatically. Because the queen never stopped laying eggs. And that's when the plot twist happened. The kind of reversal that completely changes how you see everything that came before. For weeks, researchers monitoring a colony under controlled scarcity conditions observed exactly this behavior. At first, they interpreted it as a temporary defense mechanism. Something that would stop as soon as food returned. A cruel but rational adjustment. They were wrong. What they discovered was that, after a certain point, the colony did not return to its previous behavior even when food was reintroduced. The system had been reconfigured. The workers continued consuming larvae even with full reserves. As if the nest had learned a new pattern. As if the line between caring and consuming had been erased forever within that collective organism. But that wasn't what kept the researchers awake at night. What truly disturbed them was another piece of data. A small detail, almost imperceptible in the records. But once you understand what it means, it becomes impossible to ignore. During the period of cannibalism, the queen's egg-laying rate had increased. Not decreased. Increased. As if the system had found a perfect and disturbing balance. The queen generating life at maximum speed, and the colony consuming that life in a controlled way, using its own offspring as fuel to keep existing. A closed loop. An engine that feeds on itself. And the question that no researcher has been able to answer with certainty to this day is the simplest, and the most terrifying of all. Did the colony know what it was doing? Or did the system simply work? The drought passed. The rains returned. The forest woke up again. Insects reappeared on the leaves. Natural sugar sources began to flow once more. The food that had vanished for weeks was back, abundant, accessible, waiting. The foraging workers went out as usual. They returned loaded. The stores were replenished. The nest began to pulse again with its former energy. Everything went back to normal. Except nothing went back to normal. When researchers analyzed the colony weeks after the end of the scarcity, what they found was not the same organism as before. On the outside, it looked identical. The trails, the tunnels, the organization, the queen at the center of everything, all in place. But the numbers told a different story. The larval population was significantly below what would be expected for a colony of that size with full access to food. The nursery chambers, which should have been overflowing with life, were partially empty. And the workers responsible for brood care still displayed that strange behavior, that hesitation, that prolonged presence around the young larvae. The pattern had not been turned off. It had been absorbed. But that wasn't the worst part. What came next was the data point that made the researchers stop writing for a moment and simply sit in silence in front of the records. The queen had increased her egg-laying rate during the crisis. That was already known. But what the data showed was that she had not returned to her previous rhythm after the food came back. She continued producing eggs at an accelerated rate, as if her biological system had been recalibrated by the pressure of scarcity. More eggs being produced, fewer larvae surviving to adulthood. A cycle that kept spinning even without necessity. The colony had developed a behavior that did not exist before the crisis. A behavior that no longer had a rational function, because the threat had passed. And yet it persisted anyway, encoded at some level of the collective organism like a memory the system did not know how to erase. And that's when the most disturbing question of the entire study emerged. It wasn't about ants. It was about what happens to any living system, any group, any structure, any collective organism, when it is forced to cross a line in order to survive. Does the line return? Or does it simply disappear? Because what this colony showed was not just that ants are capable of cannibalism in extreme situations. That was already known. What it revealed was something far more unsettling. That a system can go through a crisis, survive it, resolve the problem that caused it, and still continue acting as if the crisis had never ended. As if the trauma, if we can call it that, had become part of normal functioning. As if survival carried a cost that does not appear in mortality statistics. The colony is still there to this day. Strong, organized, efficient, with its trails, its sentinels, its queen at the center generating life non-stop. And deep within, in the darkest chambers of the nest, workers that once learned to turn their own offspring into fuel continue making their rounds through the nursery. Caring, or perhaps doing something that no longer has a simple name. Because when a system discovers it can feed on itself to survive, and it works, that discovery does not disappear when the danger passes. It remains, waiting for the next drought. The question is not whether this happens with ants. The question is, how many other systems do you know the T have learned the same thing?